How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 79th video on the channel, and today we're going to be starting another book, Being in Time, by Martin Heidegger. Published in 1927, the work is often considered to be Heidegger's magnum opus, as well as one of the most important and influential books in 20th century continental philosophy. As the title suggests, Heidegger is primarily concerned with the question of the meaning of being, and its relationship with temporality, a project that, as we will soon see, is much more intricate and complex than it might appear at first. This video focuses on the first two sections of the introduction, where Heidegger seeks to demonstrate both the necessity and the shape of a question of being. However, before we begin, I think a note on the version of Being in Time used in the series would be useful. There are two main translations available, an older one by John Macquarie and Edward Robinson, and a newer one by Joan Stambaugh. I am using a revised edition of the latter, although, for the sake of convenience, I am also following a few conventions of the former, namely capitalizing being when used to describe what Heidegger is seeking the meaning of, opposing it to lowercase beings or particular entities. This is solely for my own sanity. Uppercase being is not meant to be some sort of magical thing that exists beyond the lowercase beings that it determines as such. Instead, capitalization is just there to render the distinction in German between the terms Sein and Seiende in English. Finally, I would also like to thank my friend Thimg for their help in refining this video. Their knowledge of Heidegger was invaluable. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Heidegger begins Being in Time by claiming that, for a long time, the question of being itself has been forgotten. Quoting Plato in The Sophist, he relates that this was done to avoid rekindling a battle of giants concerning being. In fact, he goes as far as to say that Plato and Aristotle were essentially the last people to truly be invested in working on the question, carrying out avid research that was then distorted and camouflaged all the way until Hegel. However, worse than this, perspectives on the meaning of being have become dogmatic. They declare that it is something superfluous, something that warrants neglect. This is due to it being said that being is simultaneously the most universal and the most empty concept, resisting definition, yet also not needing one due to its almost commonsensical usage. As Heidegger himself puts it,
everybody uses it constantly and also already understands what is meant by it. Thus, what troubled ancient philosophizing and kept it so by virtue of its obscurity has become obvious, clear as day.
Nevertheless, as we will soon see, the question of being is much more important and nuanced than it might appear at first. Going back to status as universal, undefinable and self-evident, these three aspects of being act as Heidegger's starting point, being described as prejudices. The first goes all the way back to Aristotle and his medieval disciples, the scholastics. Our author quotes one of them, Saint Thomas Aquinas, as saying that an understanding of being is always already contained in everything we apprehend in beings, although he quickly adds a caveat already known to Aristotle, that the universality of being is a little different to other things thought to be universal. It surpasses them. This is based in Aristotle's framework of genera and differentiae. Essentially, every definition has to have a genus, the kind of thing that it is, and a differentia, what sets it apart from other members of its genus. For example, triangles and quadrilaterals are both members or species of a genus of shapes, but the one has the differentia of 3 sides and the other that of 4. If you go far enough, Aristotle thought that you would arrive at 10 categories, or highest genera, things like substance, quantity, and quality. These universals could be applied to everything, although, amongst the 10, being is conspicuously absent. The reasoning for this is that it would need to have as its differentia something with non-being, which Aristotle saw as absurd. Because of this, being was deemed transcendental. It transcends the categories without being a genus itself. However, its status as universal doesn't make being any easier to understand. As shown by debates among scholastics like Aquinas and Duns Scotus, the exact relationship between it and the categories is deeply controversial, leading Heidegger to characterize the question of being's meaning as the most obscure of all. This leads us into the second prejudice, which is that being cannot be defined. Interestingly, Heidegger doesn't really disagree, saying,
Indeed, being cannot be understood as a being, but does it follow from this that being can no longer constitute a problem? Not at all. We can conclude only that being is not something like a being.
As you will see, the idea that being is not a being, in the sense of a sort of entity, is actually quite critical. However, for now, we'll just focus on the definition portion, which can be approached from two directions. First, if we go with the scholastics and say that a definition requires a genus and a differentia, then obviously we have a problem. Once again, non-being comes in. Second, as explained by a quote Heidegger gives of Pascal in a footnote, we always start definitions, implicitly or explicitly, by saying something like it is. That is immediately brings being into play, forcing us to define it with itself, which is an absurdity. However, even if being cannot be defined within the framework of medieval logic, that doesn't make it any less important. In fact, Heidegger goes as far as to say it forces it upon us. Here, we arrive at the third thing he wants to push back on, the notion that, because being is, in a sense, self-evident, there's no reason to look into it. The basis for this is closely tied to the way that being appears in all sorts of forms. It is easy to understand things like I am happy, or the sky is blue. There's a certain obviousness in the verb, called a copula, that relates things to each other. Nevertheless, once again, the fact that everyone can comprehend this element of being actually makes repeating the question even more important. There's a strange enigma, Heidegger explains, that exists in every relationship between being, what we are looking at here, and beings, in the sense of entities. We simultaneously get it on some level, and yet do not actually grasp its meaning. Closing off the first section of Being and Time, it is here that Heidegger introduces a major element of the work, the idea that the so-called self-evident and it alone is to be our central theme. When we are looking at the philosophy of the self-evident, appealing to something being nothing more than common sense is quite dubious. Drawing everything together, he states,
Consideration of the prejudices has made it clear at the same time that not only is the answer to the question of being lacking, but even the question itself is obscure and without direction.
On this note, we arrive at section 2 of a work, titled The Formal Structure of a Question of Being. Here, Heidegger aims to first describe what goes into a question, and then to see how we can structure one related to being in a clear way. His first claim is that a questioning is always a seeking, meaning that it is always guided, in some way, by what is being sought after. In our case, with being as our concern, we need to be familiar with it to some extent, even if we only have what Heidegger describes as an average and vague understanding. Although it is obscured and distorted, this, tied to the third prejudice, still makes our questioning possible in the first place. In this essentially anatomical diagram, you can see the other three elements that structure questions, along with their related names in German. First, there's what is asked about, which is simply being itself. Second, there's what is interrogated. Here things get a little more complicated. it is clear that we should interrogate beings in the entitarian sense, but the problem is working out what sort of beings. For now, we'll just put this to the side. Finally, the third moment of a questioning is what we try to ascertain, which takes the form of the meaning of being. Returning to the first element, what is asked about, the idea that being is not itself a being, becomes crucial. Basically, we want to know about what determines beings as such, but we shouldn't act like it has an existence similar to that of an entity, something we saw with Aristotle. Heidegger insists that the first step in approaching our ultimate question is to understand that we are not trying to trace a sort of genealogy that goes all the way back to some original being as a basis. When it comes to the ascertainment part of a question, as he explains,
what is to be ascertained? The meaning of being will require its own conceptualization, which again is essentially distinct from the concepts in which beings receive their determination of meaning.
The final piece is what gets interrogated, beings as entities. As mentioned earlier, it isn't immediately clear what kinds of beings we should look at. Heidegger says that there are all sorts of existence, which can be described as beings in various ways. In fact, everything we say or mean, everything we can relate together, is, in a sense, a being. However, for our purposes, we can narrow the field a bit. We ourselves, our author suggests, act as a useful jumping-off point. This is due to the fact that working out the question of a meaning of being likewise involves working out the ways of grasping or understanding it. In fact, these are modes of being of some particular things, the seekers that we are in this situation. Unlike rocks or planets, we alone can encounter the problem of being and try to reflect on it. This is where Heidegger's infamous term, Dasein, literally translated as being there, comes into play. For now, the main feature of Dasein we care about is that it describes the sort of questioning being that poses the problem under discussion. With this, it might be good to take a step back and examine what our author is trying to do. First of all, we can ask, why the term being? In some ways, it seems like Heidegger is simply trying to sneak in essences under another name, the natures that define certain things as such, like the three sides that make a triangle. However, going back to the notion that there are all kinds of existence, being for Heidegger is a bit broader than essence. In fact, it also includes existence itself, something that is traditionally distinguished quite forcefully from essence. Listing the kinds of things he's concerned with, where essence and existence are described as whatness and thatness respectively, Heidegger writes,
being is found in thatness and whatness, reality, the objective presence of things, subsistence, validity, existence, and in the there is.
Second, moving on to Dasein, it might appear strange not to use a word like human instead. According to Richard Polt, whose guide to Heidegger informs quite a bit of this video, the main reason for the coinage is to force us to think about being a little differently than usual. This manifests in quite a few different ways. For example, Dasein is sourced from a verb. Rather than being reducible to a regular noun like person, it is more like an activity that we do. Next, there's the da portion, meaning there. Whilst a planet or stone might have a location in time and space, existing there in one sense, we are unique in how we engage with the world. Our being is there in another sense, inhabiting some context or other in a very niche way. This is actually another important theme in Being and Time, which dedicates many pages to it and its relationship with Dasein. Jumping ahead a little, this also stresses the absolute importance of having a world or context in the first place. Without being there, we would be nothing at all. In fact, as stressed by this diagram, the relationship between the world and Dasein is a reciprocal one. Continuing with Polt, his example is that of Germany in 1927. Without Germans to be there inside it, it just wouldn't have existed. In other words, individual Dasein is what composes the context as its parts, but Dasein is only intelligible, or a being, through how it is conditioned by that same context. With this tangent out of the way, we can return to the text. After his brief introduction of Dasein, Heidegger examines the idea that this leads to circular reasoning. An objection at this stage could be that we seem to need to understand a particular kind of being, Dasein, to ground the question of being in general. In other words, it seems we have to presuppose something that we can only discover through the answer that provides. A classic example of thinking in a circle. Nevertheless, as Heidegger puts it,
but in fact, there is no circle at all in the formulation of our question. Beings can be determined in their being without the explicit concept of the meaning of being having to be already available.
Ultimately, all Heidegger wants to do is clear the ground. He isn't aiming to take being as some principle that can then be applied to prove whatever he likes. Rather, the goal is to continually refine and uncover what has been hidden for a long time. That is, the meaning of being. In this way, and somewhat ironically, we can say that being in time has the structure of a spiral. It spins around and around in its descent towards being, deepening our understanding of it with each pass. Returning to Dasein and the idea of interrogation, Heidegger ends this section of a work by touching on the status of the former.
Neither has the priority of Dasein been demonstrated, nor has anything been decided about its function as the primary being to be interrogated. But certainly, something like a priority has announced itself.
It's on this note that we finish the first two sections of Being in Time by Martin Heidegger, having explored some aspects of how to formulate the question of being and the reasons why doing so is so important. As we will see in the next videos in the series, there is a lot to say about being, even if it already doesn't feel like a word anymore. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll most likely be continuing this text or the Monadology by G.W. Leibniz. Until then, bye!